Ethan Walker had not spoken a kind word to another living soul in 3 years. He had made peace with that. He had made peace with a lot of things: the silence, the cold, the way mornings came and went without meaning. But the morning Duke stopped walking, the morning that old horse planted all 4 hooves in the dirt and refused to move another inch toward home, was the morning everything Ethan had buried came clawing its way back to the surface. And somewhere beneath the rock and the shadow and the ruin of Black Hollow Mine, a woman was still alive. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and come along for the ride. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I love seeing how far this story travels. Now settle in, because this one's going to take everything you've got. The summer of 1887 came to the Montana high country like a punishment. The heat pressed down on the ridgelines and cooked the grass yellow before July even finished its first week. Creeks that had run fat and cold through May were down to thin ribbons by August, and the cattle in the valley below were restless and mean from thirst. Up on the higher trails where the pine grew thick and the wind usually offered some mercy, even the shade felt wrong, heavy and close, like something was holding its breath. Ethan Walker paid none of it much attention. He had learned over 3 years of living alone on the mountain to stop registering discomfort. Heat, cold, hunger. They were just conditions. Weather. Things that happened to the body while the mind stayed somewhere else entirely. He moved his horses through the high summer the way he moved through everything, quietly, efficiently, and without any particular desire to linger. He had 12 horses in his string that season. Good stock, most of them quarter horses, and Mustang crosses bred for the altitude, sure-footed on loose shale, smart enough not to spook at shadows. He knew every one of them by name, by temperament, by the particular way each one held its head when it was nervous. He knew horses the way other men knew their families, which was fitting, because horses were the only family he had left. Duke was the oldest, 17 years old, and showing it in the gray around his muzzle, and the deliberate way he placed each hoof, like a man who has learned to be careful because he's been hurt before. But Duke was still the one Ethan trusted most. There was something in that horse, a steadiness, a kind of quiet authority that the younger animals recognized and deferred to. When Duke moved, the others followed. When Duke stopped, the whole string stopped. That afternoon, Duke stopped. They were coming back down from the eastern pasture following a trail Ethan had ridden 100 times, the sun dropping toward the peaks and throwing long shadows across the switchbacks. It was a routine ride. It was supposed to be a routine ride. Duke halted. Not the gradual slowing of a tired horse. Not the hesitation of an animal that had spotted something on the trail ahead. A hard, sudden stop, all 4 feet, planted ears forward, nostrils working the air. "Come on," Ethan said. He kept his voice low and even, the way he always did with horses. "We're losing light." Duke didn't move. Ethan clicked his tongue, applied gentle pressure with his heels. Nothing. He looked at the trail ahead. No rattlesnake, no loose rock, no obvious reason for the refusal. He looked at the rest of the string. They had all stopped, too clustered behind Duke, heads up, ears pricked. "What is it?" Ethan murmured, more to himself than to the horse. Duke turned his head. Not forward. Not toward the trail home. He turned it to the left, toward the long slope of broken ground that led up to Black Hollow Mine, and he stood there, with his ears locked on something Ethan couldn't hear. Ethan had not looked at Black Hollow in years. He looked at it now. The mine entrance was maybe 300 yards up the slope. A dark slot cut into the granite face, the old timber frame rotting and half collapsed. The ground around it littered with rusted equipment and the rubble of a collapse that had happened the winter of '84. 3 men had died in that collapse. The whole operation had shut down 6 months later when the ore ran out, and since then, Black Hollow had been exactly what it looked like, a wound in the mountain that never quite healed. No one went up there. There was no reason to. Duke made a sound, not a whinny, not a snort, but something low and urgent in the back of his throat, and turned his head toward the mine again. "There's nothing up there," Ethan said. And then he heard it. It was faint. So faint, he thought for a moment he had imagined it, a trick of the wind moving through the old timber or the sound of rock settling deep in the mountain. But it came again, and this time there was no mistaking it. A human voice, a woman's voice, And even at that distance, even muffled by rock and timber and 3 years of silence, what he heard in it was unmistakable. Desperation. Ethan sat very still on his horse for what felt like a long time. "Not your business," said something inside him. Something that had gotten very good at saying that over the past 3 years. "Not your problem. Turn the horses around and go home." He dismounted. He tied the string to a scrub pine at the base of the slope and started up toward the mine entrance on foot, telling himself the whole way that he was probably going to find nothing. A trapped animal, and echo his own mind playing tricks in the heat. He had been alone long enough that his mind had started doing things like that. Conjuring sounds, inventing presences. The slope was loose and treacherous, the ground around the old workings broken up by years of freeze and thaw. He picked his way carefully the way Duke had taught him, deliberate, unhurried choosing each step. The mine entrance grew larger as he climbed the darkness inside it, absolute and cool-smelling, the kind of underground cold that hit you like stepping into a cellar. He stopped at the entrance. "Hello," he called. Silence. He waited. "Hello," he said again louder, and from somewhere deep inside the mountain, muffled and hoarse and barely holding together, a voice answered him. "Help me. Please. Is someone there? Please help me." Ethan reached into the saddlebag he'd carried up the slope, found the short candle stub and matches he always kept there, and lit the candle. The flame threw a small circle of yellow light into the darkness. He ducked under the rotting timber frame and went in. The tunnel was low-ceilinged and narrow, shored up with old timbers that had gone gray and soft with moisture. The floor was uneven, littered with old equipment, broken picks, rusted chain, the collapsed remains of a ore cart that had been sitting in the same spot for probably a decade. The smell was cold rock and old wood, and something damp and mineral that sat in the back of his throat. He followed the sound of her voice. She guided him in calling out every 30 seconds or so, short, controlled words like she was rationing her strength. "Here. Over here. Left at the junction. Keep going." She had been at this long enough to know how to do it, which told him something about how long she had been down here. He found her in a chamber about 60 feet in from the entrance. She was sitting on the floor, with her back against a support post, a length of heavy chain locked around her left wrist and bolted to an iron ring sunk into the rock. She was wearing a dress, gray, simple schoolteacher cut, that was torn at the hem and stained with what looked like days' worth of dirt. Her dark hair had come loose from whatever arrangement it had started in and hung in clumps around her face. There was a bruise along her left jaw, yellowed at the edges, and a cut above her eyebrow that had been cleaned and then rebled and was now crusted over. She looked up at him when his candle reached her, and the thing he saw in her eyes was not relief. It was a gun. She had it leveled at his chest before he even processed that she was holding it, a small revolver, a .32, by the look of it, gripped in both hands, remarkably steady for someone who had been chained in a mine for what must have been several days. "Back up," she said. Her voice was raw and cracked from thirst, but the gun didn't waver. Ethan stopped. He held the candle out to the side, not toward her, so she could see his face without being blinded. He kept his right hand away from the Colt on his hip. "I'm not one of them," he said. "I don't know what you are," she said. "Back up." "I heard you calling." "I was calling for anyone. I didn't know who'd come." He understood that. He didn't argue with it. He took one slow step back and crouched down, bringing himself lower than her eye level, so he was looking up at her instead of down. He'd learned that with horses getting smaller made nervous things less nervous. "My name is Ethan Walker," he said. "I run horses on the high pastures above Creed. I've been up here alone for 3 years. I'm not connected to whoever put you down here, and I'd like to get you out if you'll let me." A long silence. The gun stayed up. "How do I know that?" she said. "You don't," he said. "Not yet, but I'd point out that if I was one of them, I'd have taken that gun away from you already, instead of crouching in the dirt, telling you my name." Another silence, shorter this time. "The chain," she said. "It's bolted to the wall. They took the key. I'll need to get closer to look at it. Her jaw tightened. The gun moved a fraction, not down, but not forward either. Reconsidering. Don't touch anything except the chain, she said. All right. He moved closer slowly, keeping his hands visible. The chain was old, but the bolt was new. Someone had planned this, had brought equipment. He examined the ring in the rock, the links of the chain, the lock. He looked around the chamber for anything that might serve as a pry bar. His eyes landed on a length of iron rod half buried under collapsed timber in the corner. I'm going to get that rod over there, he said. And I'm going to try to work the bolt out of the wall. It'll take a few minutes. You can keep that gun on me the whole time. She watched him retrieve the rod, watched him position himself against the wall next to the iron ring. He worked methodically, using the rod as a lever, prying at the mortar around the bolt, stopping twice when the timber above them creaked and settled. She watched every move he made and kept the gun pointed at the center of his back. After 12 minutes, he counted them to keep himself calm. The bolt gave way. The chain came loose from the wall and fell against the rock floor with a clatter that echoed through the tunnel. She gasped, not from pain, but from something that went deeper than pain. The first exhale of a person who has been holding their breath for days. He turned around carefully. The gun was still up. I still have to get out of the cuff, she said. Her voice had changed slightly harder at the edges, like she was bracing herself against the relief. The lock on the cuff is a different problem, he said. We can deal with it outside. You've got enough chain free to walk. She stared at him. I'm not going out there until I know it's safe, she said. The trail looked clear when I came up, he said. But we shouldn't wait. If whoever put you here checks on you regular. They come every 2 days, she said, to bring water. When's the last time they came? A pause. She was calculating, and he could see from her face that the calculation didn't leave a lot of margin. Yesterday morning, she said. Then we move now, he said. Getting her out of the mine took longer than getting in. She was weaker than she was letting on. Her legs had gone stiff from sitting on cold rock for days, and she stumbled twice in the tunnel, catching herself against the timber supports rather than reaching for his arm. He didn't offer the arm. He could read people the same way he read horses, and he knew she needed to do this under her own power, needed to not be carried, needed to feel the floor coming up under her own feet. When they came out into the late afternoon sun, she stopped and put her hand over her eyes and stood absolutely still for a moment. The light after the darkness must have hit like a physical thing. He waited. There's water in my saddlebag, he said when she lowered her hand. I'll get it. I know you can, he said. I'll get it anyway. He went down the slope to where the horses were tied, pulled a canteen from the saddlebag. When he came back up, she was sitting on a flat rock with her knees together and the chain coiled in her lap, the gun still in her right hand, though she'd lowered it. He handed her the canteen without comment. She drank. Not greedily controlled, measured sips, the way someone drinks when they're smart enough to know what gulping will do to an empty stomach. When she handed the canteen back, she looked at him steadily. Charlotte Reed, she said. I'm the school teacher in Harlan Creek. Ethan nodded. What happened to you? He said. She was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that isn't hesitation. It's a person deciding how much to say, how much to trust. I saw something I wasn't supposed to see, she said finally. What kind of something? She looked at him for a long moment. Really looked at him the way a person looks at a stranger when they're trying to read 3 years of character in 30 seconds. Victor Harlan killed a family, she said. The Murphys. He killed all of them. Thomas Murphy, his wife, their youngest boy, who was maybe 12 years old, and had the land recorded in his own name the next morning. I found out because I was at the records office. I saw the date on the filing. I had already heard what happened to the Murphys. She paused. I'd written it all down. In a ledger. Dates, names, what I saw, what I could prove. Ethan let that sit for a moment. Where's the ledger? Hidden, she said. In my schoolroom. Inside the wall behind the blackboard. Does Harlan know where it is? No. He knows I have something. He doesn't know what or where. Her hand tightened on the chain in her lap. That's the only reason I'm still alive." Ethan looked down the slope at his horses. Duke was watching him from where he was tied still and steady as a statue, that old gray muzzle pointed in his direction like a compass needle. He had not been to Harlan Creek in over a year. He had not been anywhere near other people by intention, by preference, by the careful architecture of a life built around keeping everyone at arm's length. He had supplies enough for another 2 months. He had no interest in Victor Harlan, or the politics of valley towns, or the particular cruelties that men with money applied to men without it. He looked at Charlotte Reed. She had lowered the gun now finally, and was looking at the mountains the way a person looks at something they weren't sure they'd see again. There was no performance in it, no waiting for him to say something, no appeal, no manipulation. She was just looking at the mountains. "My cabin's 3 miles up the East Ridge," he said. "You can get that cuff off and get some food in you and figure out what you want to do next." She looked at him. "I'm not asking for your help," she said. It wasn't defiant, it was just precise. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking." "I know you're not," he said. "Come on, we're burning daylight." He put her on Duke for the ride up. He led the string on foot. He knew the trail well enough to do it in his sleep, and the horse she most needed was the steadiest one he had. Duke carried her up the switchbacks with that slow, deliberate gait, patient and reliable, and Ethan watched from below. The way the horse moved under her careful, the way he got with anyone new as if he knew they needed gentling. She didn't talk on this way up. Neither did he. The silence between them was different from the silence he was used to. There was another person in it, which changed everything, and he found himself aware of that in a way he hadn't expected. The way you notice a sound only when it stops. When they reached the cabin, he brought the horses into the corral first, unsaddled them, checked their hooves, made sure the water trough was full. She waited without complaint, sitting on the fence rail with the chain across her knees, watching him work. He could feel her watching. He didn't acknowledge it. Inside, he built a fire, even though the evening was warm, because warmth was what a person needed after days in cold rock. He found the bolt cutters he kept in the toolbox under the workbench and cut the cuff off her wrist. The skin beneath it was raw and abraded one spot, where it had cut deep enough to leave a wound that had been slowly weeping. He brought water and a clean cloth and set them on the table without a word. She cleaned the wound herself. He put dried venison and hard bread on the table and a pot of water on for coffee, and went back out to check on the horses again because she needed the space, and he was honest enough with himself to admit that he did too. When he came back in, she was sitting at the table with her hands folded, the venison half eaten, looking at the fire. "You live alone up here," she said. "Yes." "By choice?" "Yes." She nodded slowly, as if she'd already known the answer, and was just confirming something she'd read in the lines of the place, the single chair, the single cup on the shelf, the absence of anything that suggested another person had ever made room for themselves in this space. "I won't be any trouble," she said. "I know," he said, "and I'll leave as soon as I can figure out a way to do it safely." "I know that too." She looked at him, then really looked with those steady dark eyes that had held a gun on him in a mine 2 hours ago and hadn't flinched. "Why'd you come in after me?" she said. "You could have just walked away. You didn't know me. You had no obligation." Ethan Walker sat down across from her, wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, and thought about how to answer a question he hadn't thought to ask himself until this moment. "My horse wouldn't move," he said finally. "Duke. He's been telling me the truth about things for 17 years. I figured I'd better listen." She looked at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time since he'd found her chained in the dark, under a mountain, Charlotte Reed allowed herself a small, exhausted, entirely genuine smile. "You trust your horse more than people," she said. "Horses haven't given me much reason not to," he said. The fire crackled. The horses moved quietly in the corral outside. High up in the pine above the cabin, something a nighthawk maybe called once into the darkening sky. Ethan Walker had not had another person in his cabin in 3 years. He had not planned on changing that. He looked at the woman across the table. The bruised jaw, the raw wrist. the careful straightness of her spine, even now, everything, and felt something shift in his chest that he didn't have a name for anymore. Something he had packed away and sealed up and told himself he no longer needed. He did not examine it. He got up, banked the fire for the night, and went to lay out a bedroll in the corner, putting as much distance as the small space allowed between himself and whatever that feeling was. Outside, Duke stood at the corral fence in the dark and watched the cabin the way he always watched things he cared about. Patient, steady, entirely certain of what he knew. He was already awake when she screamed. Not a full scream, she caught it before it fully formed the way a person does when they've trained themselves not to show weakness, but it was enough. Ethan was off the floor and across the cabin before his mind had finished waking up. His hand finding the rifle against the wall out of pure muscle memory. His eyes cutting to the corner where he'd laid out the extra bedroll. Charlotte was sitting upright, both hands pressed flat against the floor, breathing hard. Her eyes were open. She was awake. But whatever she had been inside just a moment ago, it wasn't this cabin. "Easy," Ethan said. He kept his voice low, the same register he used with a spooked horse. He did not move closer. She looked at him, looked at the rifle in his hand, looked at the fire burned down to coals and the gray pre-dawn light coming in under the door. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be. I woke you." I wasn't sleeping much anyway. That was true, though he hadn't admitted it to himself until just now. He'd spent most of the night listening to the sounds outside, wind in the pines, horses moving in the corral, the usual mountain quiet, and measuring each one against what it was supposed to sound like. Checking. He hadn't done that in years. He hadn't had reason to. He set the rifle back against the wall and went to add wood to the fire. Charlotte pulled her knees to her chest and watched him without speaking. The bruise along her jaw had darkened overnight. In the early light, it looked worse than it had the evening before, and Ethan noticed it the way he noticed anything he couldn't fix immediately, with a quiet, contained anger he kept well below the surface. "You said they come every 2 days," he said, crouching by the fire. "Yes. So today. Probably mid-morning." She paused. "When they find the chain pulled out of the wall, they'll know someone helped me. They'll start looking." "I know. They'll look up here eventually. Harlan's men know this mountain better than most people think." Ethan fed the fire a second piece of wood and sat back on his heels. He had already been through this in his head during the night. The calculation wasn't complicated, but the answer it kept producing was one he hadn't planned for. "Then we have until mid-morning to figure out what comes next," he said. Charlotte unfolded herself from the bedroll and stood smoothing down her dress with the automatic dignity of a woman who had decided somewhere in the middle of a mine shaft that she was going to carry herself like herself, no matter what condition she was in. "I need to get back to Harlan Creek," she said. Ethan looked at her. "The ledger," she said. "Without it, there's no proof. Harlan walks free. The Murphys stay dead and buried under a land claim that isn't theirs, and I spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder." She met his eyes steadily. "I'm not willing to do that." "The town's 12 miles by the main trail," he said. "You'd be in the open the entire ride. If Harlan's men are already moving. I know the risk." "Do you?" Her chin came up a fraction. "Mr. Walker, I've been chained to a wall for 4 days. I'm very clear on what these men are willing to do." He held her gaze for a moment, then looked away. She had a point. She had several points, and the most uncomfortable one was this. It wasn't his decision to make. He stood up. "I know a way into Harlan Creek that doesn't use the main trail. Longer, but it keeps you out of sight most of the way." He crossed to the shelf above the workbench and took down the battered tin where he kept his coffee. "Eat something first." She opened her mouth, and he could see the objection forming some version of, "I don't need your help," or "Don't do this on my account," and he cut it off before it arrived. "The horses need an hour anyway," he said. "Eat." She closed her mouth, sat down at the table. And for the first time since he'd found her, Charlotte Reed did what someone else told her to do. They were 2 miles down the eastern slope when they heard the riders. Not close, still far enough below them that the sound was just a murmur of hoofbeats through the trees, but moving and moving upward, which meant Harlan's men hadn't waited for mid-morning. They'd found the mine empty, or someone had checked early, and now they were coming. Ethan put his hand up without speaking. The whole string stopped. Charlotte, riding Duke again, sat very still. "How many?" she said quietly. He listened. 3, maybe 4. "They're coming from the valley side." "Yes." "That means they've already been to the mine." "Yes," he said. She didn't panic. He marked that. She went very still and very focused, and he could see her thinking behind her eyes, running calculations the same way she'd guided him through the mine in the dark, measured, precise, rationing her resources. "The ridge trail," she said. "It adds 2 hours. I know." She looked at him. "Can your horses handle it?" "Yes." "Then the ridge trail," she said. He turned the string without another word and pushed the pace, and Charlotte stayed on Duke without complaint, as the horse picked his way up the steeper switchbacks, moving with that old, reliable steadiness that had never once failed the people who trusted him. Below them, the riders' voices rose briefly, someone calling to someone else, and then faded. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Jamamk. They came down into Harlan Creek from the north end, threading through the back lots behind the livery, keeping the buildings between themselves and the main street. It was late morning by then, the town moving through its usual rhythms, a few horses at the hitching posts, a woman hanging washing on a line, the distant sound of hammering from somewhere near the mill. Normal. All of it completely normal, which Ethan knew meant nothing. The most dangerous kind of town was a quiet one with something to hide. He left the horses in the shadows behind the livery with a soft word to Duke, and followed Charlotte through the back alleys to the schoolhouse, which sat at the east end of town, a little apart from the other buildings, surrounded by a stubble grass yard with a single oak tree that had probably been there since before the town existed. Charlotte tried the door. Locked. She stared at the padlock for a moment. "Someone's been here," she said. Her voice was flat. "How do you know?" "I didn't lock this." She put her hand against the door, just resting it there like she was feeling for something. "I never locked the schoolroom. There's nothing in it worth stealing." She looked at Ethan. "Or there wasn't, as far as anyone knew." Harlan's men, looking for the ledger. She stepped back. "They didn't find it. If they had, there'd be no reason for any of this. They'd have nothing to hold over me. Can you get in another way?" She was already moving around the side of the building, checking windows. The second one she tried, a small one near the back, was latched, but the wood around the latch had swollen in the summer heat, and when she put pressure on the frame, it gave with a soft crack that sounded enormous in the quiet. She looked at Ethan. He looked back at her. "It's your schoolroom," he said. She climbed through the window. He followed. The ledger was exactly where she'd said, behind the blackboard, inside a gap between the plaster and the frame, wrapped in oilcloth and wedged in a space so tight and dark that you'd only know it was there if you'd put it there yourself. Charlotte pulled it free and stood holding it against her chest. For a moment, her eyes closed with the particular relief of someone recovering a thing they had not entirely believed would still be there. Then she opened it and leafed through the pages, fast and efficient, confirming what was there. "It's all here," she said. "The dates, the names, the land records, the timing. Anyone who looks at this will understand what it proves." "Who do you take it to?" Ethan said. She looked up. Something crossed her face. Frustration, maybe, or a very old and tired version of anger. "That's the problem," she said. "Sheriff Briggs is Harlan's man, has been for years. The nearest federal circuit judge comes through Rimrock, and that's 60 miles east. We could ride to Rimrock." "We could." She closed the ledger. "But Harlan has people on every main road between here and there, and if we disappear into the hills with a ledger and no witnesses, it's just our word against his when we finally arrive." She was thinking out loud now, working through it with the same methodical precision she applied to everything. We need people in this town. People who know what Harlan has been doing, who've been afraid to say it, who will say it now if someone gives them reason to believe it's safe. People like who? She looked at him directly. People like John Fielding. He's the grain merchant. His brother lost a parcel of land to Harlan 2 years ago. Ada Pruitt runs the boarding house. She knows every conversation that's been had in this town for 15 years. Reverend Moss preaches about justice every Sunday and has never once done a thing about it. Her jaw tightened. They're good people, frightened people, but good ones. And you think they'll stand up? I think they'll stand up if someone stands up first. She looked at him, and the look was direct and unsentimental and perfectly clear about what it was asking. I can't do this alone, Mr. Walker. The words sat between them. Ethan Walker had spent 3 years becoming very good at not being asked for anything. He had built his life at a specific altitude and distance precisely so that moments like this one wouldn't reach him. He was not a man who got involved in town politics or land disputes or the grinding cruelties that powerful men visited on powerless ones. He had told himself in the long quiet of the mountain that staying out of it was a kind of wisdom. Standing in a stolen-into schoolroom with a woman who had been chained in a mine for 4 days and was still somehow thinking clearly and planning strategically and trying to save a town that may or may not deserve saving. Standing here, he could hear how that sounded. All right, he said. Charlotte blinked, as if she hadn't quite expected it to be that simple. All right, she repeated. You said you couldn't do it alone. I said all right. He moved to the window. We should get out of here before someone notices the horses. They found John Fielding in the back of his grain store doing inventory with the focused unhappiness of a man who has been doing sums that don't come out right. He was a broad, sandy-haired man in his late 40s, with a farmer's hands and a merchant's wariness, and when Charlotte Reed walked through his back door, every bit of color left his face. Miss Reed, he glanced past her at Ethan. Who is he? A friend, she said. John, I need 10 minutes. You need to leave, he said very quietly. Harlan's men have been through here twice this morning asking if anyone's seen you. People know you went missing. Some people are scared. Most people are pretending not to know what that means. I know what it means, she said. Sit down, John. Please. He sat. He didn't want to, and the sitting down cost him something. She could see it. Ethan could see it. But he sat. Charlotte laid the ledger on the crate between them and opened it to the page with the Murphy land records. She didn't speak. She let him read. Fielding read for a long time. When he looked up, his face had changed. God Almighty, he said. He did it to the Murphys, Charlotte said. He did it to your brother. He's done it to 11 families in this valley in 4 years, John. I have every one of them documented. Fielding's hands were flat on the crate on either side of the open ledger. If Harlan finds out you have this, he already knows I have something. He just doesn't know where it is. She leaned forward. But that changes once we use it. Once we use it, there's no more hiding. It's out in the open, and either this town stands behind it or it doesn't. Charlotte, Fielding's voice dropped. You're asking me to go up against the most powerful man in this county. He owns the sheriff. He owns half the council. I know what I'm asking. He will ruin me. He will ruin my family. He'll keep ruining everyone else's if nobody stops him. She held his gaze. I'm not asking you to fight him. I'm asking you to stand in a room and say what you know. That's all. Just say what you know. Silence. Fielding looked at the ledger. At Charlotte. At Ethan, who had been standing near the door the whole time saying nothing because this was not his conversation to carry. Who else are you asking? Fielding said finally. Ada Pruitt, Reverend Moss, anyone else who's willing. Another silence. Longer. Ada's tougher than she looks, Fielding said quietly, almost to himself. I know she is, Charlotte said. Fielding closed his eyes for just a moment. When he opened them, something had shifted. Not courage exactly. Something more like the moment a person decides they're done being afraid, which is different from not being afraid and considerably harder. When? He said. Tonight, she said. Town hall. We bring the ledger, we bring witnesses, and we make it impossible to ignore. Fielding nodded slowly. Once. As if he was afraid that if he nodded more than once, he might change his mind.
Get the foy.
Ada Pruitt was easier than Fielding and harder than Charlotte had expected, which was to say that she agreed in under 2 minutes and then immediately started listing every obstacle between them and success, with the calm efficiency of a woman who has spent a lifetime solving problems before they became disasters. Harlan keeps 2 men at the hotel. Ada said, pouring coffee nobody had asked for because Ada Pruitt expressed care through hot beverages, and there was no stopping it. They'll see activity at the town hall and report it before you've gotten through the first page of that ledger. Can you get them out of the hotel? Charlotte asked. Ada gave her a look that contained compressed into a single expression 15 years of running a boarding house full of difficult men. I have been managing difficult men since before you were born, dear. Ethan, sitting in the corner of Ada's kitchen with a cup of coffee he hadn't asked for, felt something move in him that was almost, not quite, but almost like the beginning of a smile. Reverend Moss was harder, not because he was a coward. Ethan revised that judgment within 2 minutes of the man opening his door. Moss was not a coward. He was something more complicated, a man who had spent years preaching a gospel he genuinely believed, and then standing by while the world outside his church window failed to match a single word of it. The guilt of that had settled into him like water into rock, slow and heavy, changing his shape. He read the ledger. He sat with it for a long time. I knew about the Murphys, he said finally. His voice was very quiet. Not all of it, but I knew something wasn't right. I told myself I didn't have proof. Now you do, Charlotte said. Charlotte. He looked up. If this goes wrong tonight. If it goes wrong tonight, it goes wrong, she said. But it's been going wrong for 4 years while we all waited for someone else to fix it, Reverend. I'm not willing to wait anymore. Moss looked at Ethan, then looked at him. For the first time, really looked, taking in the trail dust and the quiet and the fact that this man was clearly not from this town and clearly had no personal stake in any of it. Why are you here? Moss asked. Ethan thought about it honestly. She needed someone to stand up first, he said. I figured it might as well be me. Moss held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded slowly and reached for his coat. They had 2 hours before nightfall. In those 2 hours, word moved through Harlan Creek the way word moves through small towns, not announced, not broadcast, but passed hand to hand in back rooms and doorways, and whispered conversations that stopped when the wrong person walked by. By the time the sun touched the western peaks, there were 14 people gathered in the town hall, seated on the hard wooden chairs, with the particular posture of people who are doing something they know carries a cost. Ethan stood near the back door. He had positioned himself there deliberately. He was not part of this, not really, not in the way these people were the ones who lived here, whose children went to Charlotte's school, whose land bordered Harlan's, whose lives were woven into this valley in ways his hadn't been for 3 years. His job as he understood it was not to speak. It was to be there. To be the person who'd already decided so that the ones still deciding could feel the weight of it. Charlotte stood at the front of the room. She had cleaned herself up as best she could with Ada's help. Her hair pinned back a borrowed shawl, covering the worst of the damage to her dress, and she held the ledger in both hands and looked at the 14 frightened people sitting in front of her, and she began to talk. She was good at it. Not polished, not the smooth performance of a politician or a preacher. She was just direct and clear and completely without drama, which was somehow more compelling than drama would have been. She laid out the facts the way she'd laid them out in the ledger. Dates, names, what she'd witnessed, what she could prove. She didn't minimize it, didn't soften it, didn't ask anyone to feel anything. She just told them what had happened and let the weight of it do its own work. When she got to the Murphys, when she said Thomas Murphy's name and his wife's name and the name of the 12-year-old boy, A woman in the third row put her hand over her mouth, and her husband reached over and took her other hand without looking at her. Ethan watched the room. He watched the moment when collective very slowly to tip into something else. He'd seen it happen in a herd that shift from panic to purpose, the way the animal's energy changed direction when one of them stopped running and turned to face whatever was behind them. It was happening here. And then the door at the front of the room swung open. Victor Harlan walked in. He was a tall man, somewhere in his mid-50s, with gray at his temples, and a suit that cost more than most of these people made in a year. He walked into the room the way he walked everywhere, like a man who has never once in his life had to wonder whether he was welcome. His eyes moved across the room, cataloged everything, landed on Charlotte, and settled there with a flat, cold patience that was far more frightening than anger would have been. Behind him were two men Ethan didn't recognize. Big men, standing close to the door. The room had gone completely silent. Harlan looked at Charlotte Reed the way a man looks at a problem he is preparing to solve. "Miss Reed," he said, "I am relieved to see you're unharmed. I'd heard some very troubling rumors about your whereabouts." His voice was pleasant. That was the terrifying thing about it. It was the voice of a man who had learned that pleasantness was more effective than threats in a room full of witnesses. Charlotte held the ledger against her chest and did not step back. "Mr. Harlan," she said. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Harlan said. He began moving toward the front of the room, slow and easy, nodding to familiar faces as he passed, like a man arriving at a social function. "Frontier life can be difficult, and I believe Miss Reed may have been under some strain." "My name is John Fielding," said a voice from the second row. Harlan stopped. Fielding had gotten to his feet. His face was pale, but his hands were steady. "My brother Daniel lost his land to you in 1885. I've looked the other way for 2 years. I'm not looking the other way anymore." Silence. Then Ada Pruitt from the far side of the room, without getting up from her chair. "My late husband's parcel, the one on the South Fork, you bought that for 1/3 of what it was worth 2 months after you had the water rights redirected." She folded her hands in her lap. "I have always known what that was." Harlan looked at the room, looked at the faces. The calculation was visible in his eyes, a rapid, precise assessment of what he was seeing and what it would cost. Then he looked at Ethan. Ethan Walker had not moved from the back wall. He was leaning against it with his arms loose at his sides, watching. Harlan looked at him for a moment. "I don't believe I know you," he said. "No," Ethan said. "You don't. You're not from this town." "No." "Then I'd ask what business you have here." Ethan considered the question. He looked at Charlotte, who was still standing at the front of the room with the ledger held to her chest and 14 people at her back. "She needed somebody to be here," Ethan said. "So I'm here." Something shifted in Harlan's face, just briefly. Not fear, not yet, but the first recognition that the room he had walked into was not the room he had expected. He looked at the door, at his 2 men, at the 14 people sitting in the chairs. "This isn't over," he said, very quietly, "just for the room." "No," Charlotte said, equally quiet. "It isn't, because tomorrow morning I'm sending a copy of everything in this ledger to the federal circuit judge in Rimrock, and 3 people in this room are signing witness statements tonight, and none of that stops because you walk back out that door." Harlan held her gaze. And then, because there was nothing else to do in a room full of witnesses with a documented ledger and a woman who was not going to flinch, he turned and walked back out. The room exhaled. Fielding sat down heavily in his chair. Ada Pruitt straightened her shawl. The woman in the third row was still holding her husband's hand, but she had lowered it from her mouth, and she was breathing steadily now, deliberately, like someone choosing to be calm. Charlotte turned to look at Ethan. He nodded once. She nodded back. Outside in the dark beyond the town hall windows, a horse moved. And somewhere in the direction of the hotel, a door slammed hard enough that everyone in the room heard it. Harlan's men were moving, which meant the night was not over, not even close. Ethan moved first. He was at the side window before anyone else in the room had finished processing the sound of that slamming door. his hand finding the rifle he'd leaned against the wall when they'd come in. He looked out into the dark without showing himself and counted what he could see. 2 horses at the far end of the street, moving fast, headed toward the hotel. A 3rd figure on foot, cutting across the alley beside the dry goods store. "How many men does Harlan keep in town?" he said without turning around. Fielding answered, "Usually 4, sometimes 6 if he's expecting trouble. He came in here with 2, that leaves at least 2 more unaccounted for." Ethan turned from the window. "We need to move the ledger, right now, not tomorrow morning now." Charlotte was already thinking the same thing. He could see it in the way she had tucked the ledger under her arm and positioned herself near the back door. 3 years alone on a mountain had taught Ethan to read landscape. What he was learning faster than he expected was that Charlotte Reed was a kind of landscape too, one with its own weather patterns, its own fault lines, its own particular way of signaling what was coming. "Ada," Charlotte said, "is there somewhere in your boarding house that hasn't been searched?" "Twice today?" Ada said, standing with remarkable composure for a woman of 62 who had just watched the most powerful man in the county walk out of a room without getting what he came for. "He had men through my linen closets." "The church," said Reverend Moss. He was pulling on his coat with the quiet deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and intends to see it through. "The vestry. There's a floor panel under the altar that's been there since the building went up in 71. Nobody knows about it except me." "Then that's where it goes," Charlotte said. "I'll take it," Moss said and held out his hand. Charlotte looked at him for just a moment, the kind of look that passes a full conversation in a second, and gave him the ledger. Moss took it and walked out the side door without another word, his coat collar up against the dark, moving with a purpose that his Sunday sermons had not managed to produce in years. Ethan watched him go, and marked him as a man who had been waiting a long time for a reason to be who he preached he was. "Everyone else goes home," Ethan said to the room. "Normal as you can make it. Don't talk to anyone tonight. Don't answer questions. If Harlan's men come to your door, you were at a church meeting about the Fall Harvest Fund. That's all." Fielding nodded. He was pale, but steady. "What about you two?" Ethan looked at Charlotte. Charlotte looked at Ethan. "We'll manage," she said. They went out the back way through the alley that ran behind the feed store, staying close to the buildings. The town felt different at night, smaller and larger at the same time, the familiar daylight geometry all shifted into shadow and angle, and the particular menace of not knowing what was on the other side of every doorway. Charlotte kept pace with him without being told to. She didn't reach for his arm. She didn't ask which way. She read his direction from the way he moved and matched it, and he found that quality in her, that ability to follow, without surrendering, more useful than almost anything else she could have offered in that moment. They were halfway down the alley when the figure stepped out of the shadows ahead of them. Ethan had the rifle up before he could see the man's face. "Easy." The voice was young, scared. A boy maybe 17 years old wearing a stable hand's clothes, holding both hands out from his sides. "I'm not one of Harlan's. I work the livery. I need to talk to Miss Reed." Charlotte touched Ethan's arm, just lightly, just to acknowledge it. He lowered the rifle by a degree, not all the way. "Talk," she said. The boy swallowed. "Mr. Harlan's man Deke, the big one with the beard, he went to the livery an hour ago. Told me to saddle 6 horses and have them ready. I heard him say they were going up the mountain tonight." He looked at Ethan. "He said something about a cabin. Said they were going to burn it so the cowboy had nowhere to come back to." The words hit Ethan somewhere below the ribs. His horses, his cabin. 3 years of building something that required nothing from anyone and asked nothing in return. The one arrangement he'd managed to make with the world that actually worked. "When?" Ethan said. "Maybe an hour ago they left. Maybe less." Ethan turned on his heel and walked back the way they'd come. "Ethan," Charlotte was right behind him. "I heard. You can't go up there alone. I'm not going up there to fight them. I'm going up there for the horses." He kept moving. "Duke's in that corral, the whole string." She grabbed his arm, and he stopped because the grip was not a suggestion. Listen to me, she said. If Harlan's men are already on the mountain, you ride up there alone. You're riding into 6 guns in the dark on your own ground. They'll be waiting for that. That's exactly what they'll be waiting for. Her hand was still on his arm. Think. He wanted to pull free. The want of it was physical, urgent, the instinct of a man whose entire remaining world had just been targeted. But she was right, and he knew she was right, and the knowing of it was its own particular pain. "What do you suggest?" he said. His voice came out flatter than he intended. "The livery boy," she said. She turned back to the kid who was watching them with wide eyes. "Can you ride?" "Yes, ma'am. There's a man named Caleb Pruitt who works the north pasture for the Hendersons, Ada's nephew. Do you know him?" "Yes, ma'am, I know Caleb." "Ride out to him. Tell him what you told us. Tell him to bring whoever he can and go to the East Ridge by the way of Crow Creek, quietly, no lights." She looked at Ethan. "Caleb knows that mountain. He ran cattle up there for 2 years before Harlan pushed the Hendersons out." Ethan stared at her. "You know a lot about the people in this valley," he said. "I'm a school teacher," she said. "Their children told me everything." He held her gaze for just a moment, and then something inside him, some last stubborn resistance to the idea that other people could be useful, could be trusted, could actually help without making things worse, cracked clean through. "Go," he told the livery boy. "Ride fast." The boy ran. They reached the horses, 2 of the string Ethan had left at the edge of town, and pushed hard up the switchback trail, Ethan in front, Charlotte on Duke, both of them moving without lights because lights would announce them a mile ahead, and because the horses knew this trail by now and didn't need them. The first thing they smelled was smoke, not close, but there. Above them, somewhere on the upper slope, a thin thread of it on the night air, bitter and wrong against the pine smell of the mountain. Charlotte pulled Duke up beside him. "The cabin." "Not the cabin," he said. He had already been reading the direction of it the way the smoke drifted on the breeze. "The feed shed. It's 100 yards east of the cabin." "Why the shed?" "To drive me toward the cabin," he said. "Where they'll be waiting." She went quiet for a moment, absorbing that. "They know how you think," she said. "They know how a man who loves his horses thinks." He swung down from the saddle and tied his horse to a pine branch. "Which is how they'd expect me to come straight up the main trail fast, worried about the animals." He looked at her. "Stay here." "Absolutely not." "Charlotte, if I stay here alone and one of them circles around, I'm a woman alone in the dark on a mountain. That is considerably more dangerous than whatever you're riding toward." She was already off Duke. "I'm not staying." He wanted to argue. He looked at her face and understood it would cost him time he didn't have. "Then stay behind me," he said. "And when I say get down, you get down. No discussions." Agreed. They went up on foot off the trail, moving through the trees, the way Ethan had moved through this mountain for 3 years, slowly enough to be silent, reading the ground through the soles of his boots, letting the dark work for him instead of against him. He could hear voices now. Not close, but getting closer as they climbed, 2 men talking with the comfortable confidence of people who expect to be the only ones awake. He found them before they found him. 2 men posted at the edge of the tree line above the corral. The corral where his horses were. He couldn't see the horses yet from here, couldn't hear them moving, and the absence of that sound squeezed something cold around his heart. He turned his head and found Charlotte right behind him, close enough that he could feel the warmth off her without touching. He held up 2 fingers pointed toward the tree line. She nodded. He made a motion with his hand, stay, and started to move. Her hand found his wrist in the dark. Not grabbing, just a touch. He turned. She pointed to the right. Through the trees, maybe 30 yards further on, the orange glow of something burning small, controlled not the cabin, the shed, and the silhouette of a man standing near it. A 3rd man he hadn't seen. He held up 3 fingers in question. She shook her head and held up 4. 4. He looked at the tree line again. Recalculated. He pulled back next to her and put his mouth close to her ear. "I need to get to the corral. If the horses are panicking, the noise covers me. If they're not, I've got 30 yards of open ground with 4 men watching." "How long until Caleb could be here?" she breathed back. 30 minutes, maybe 40. "Can the horses wait 40 minutes?" "Depends on how scared they are." As if in answer to that, somewhere in the corral, a horse screamed. It was Duke. Ethan knew the sound of every horse in his string, and Duke's voice was as familiar to him as his own breathing, and what he heard in that sound was not panic, but fury, the sound of an old horse who has had enough of whatever is being done to him. Ethan stopped thinking about cover and angles and the position of 4 armed men. He moved. He came out of the tree line fast and low, and the 2 men posted at the edge of the corral had maybe 2 seconds of warning before he was on them. Not shooting, because shooting announced him to the other 2, but using the rifle as a physical object, putting the stock into the first man's shoulder, hard enough to spin him, ducking under the second man's swing, and driving his elbow back. It was fast and ugly, and nothing like the gunfights in the dime novels. And it worked because Ethan Walker had spent 3 years building fences and hauling timber and working horses, and his body was not something he had allowed to go soft. Both men went down. He was at the corral gate in 4 strides. Duke was at the far end, pressed against the fence but upright and moving, not injured, just furious, his ears flat, his eyes showing white. The rest of the string was clustered near the gate, anxious but intact. Someone had thrown a burning branch into the corral to drive them, and the branch was on the ground near the water trough, still smoldering. Ethan kicked the branch into the trough. It hissed and died. He had about 15 seconds before the other 2 men figured out what had happened. He got 10 of them. The shot came from his left close enough that he felt the heat of it on his cheek, and he dropped to one knee behind the fence post and brought the rifle up. And the man who'd fired was already repositioning, moving fast. And Ethan tracked him in the dark, the way you track something you can't quite see. By sound and instinct, and the particular quality of movement that tells you where a person will be in 2 seconds. He didn't shoot, because from the right, a figure stepped out of the trees and put the barrel of a .32 revolver against the back of the moving man's neck. "Don't," said Charlotte Reed. The man stopped. Ethan straightened up slowly. He looked at Charlotte. She was holding the gun with both hands, her face completely steady. Her breath controlled her eyes on the man in front of her. The gun he had seen her hold in a mine shaft 4 days ago, the one she had held on him, was doing exactly what she'd trained it to do. "On the ground," she said. "Face down." The man went down. "You said you'd stay back," Ethan said. "I said I'd stay behind you," she said. "You moved faster than expected." The 4th man had vanished into the trees, running from the sound of it. Ethan listened until he couldn't hear footsteps anymore, then turned back to the corral. Duke had come to the gate on his own. He stood there with his nose over the top rail, looking at Ethan with that steady gray-muzzled patience that had not changed in 17 years, as if he'd known all along that Ethan was coming and had simply been waiting for him to get there. Ethan put his hand against the horse's jaw and held it there for a moment with his eyes closed. "I know," he said. "I know. We're all right." Caleb Pruitt arrived 35 minutes later with 2 ranch hands from the Henderson spread, and the situation he found was not what he'd expected. 2 of Harlan's men sitting against the corral fence, with their hands bound with tack rope, one of them nursing a dislocated shoulder, and a schoolteacher and a mountain cowboy sitting on the fence rail in the dark, waiting. Caleb was a lean, weather-burnt man of 40, with his Aunt Ada's composure and his own brand of economy of expression. He looked at the scene for a long moment, then looked at Ethan. "You 2 do this yourselves," he said. "Mostly," Ethan said. Caleb looked at Charlotte. She was still holding the .3, too loosely now at her side. He considered this for a moment. "Aunt Ada told me about you," he said. "Said you were stubborn." "She's not wrong," Charlotte said. Caleb almost smiled. "What do you need?" "Someone to stay with the horses tonight," Ethan said. "And someone to ride to Rimrock at first light with a letter for the circuit judge." "I can do both," Caleb said. He looked at his 2 ranch hands who nodded. "These 2." He meant the men against the fence. They'll need to be somewhere they can't get word to Harlan before morning, Ethan said. Caleb nodded, as if this were a perfectly routine request. Henderson's got a root cellar that locks from the outside. That'll do, Ethan said. Inside the cabin that was still standing because Harlan's men had been sent to frighten not to finish, which told Ethan something important about how Harlan was calculating his risk. Charlotte sat at the table and wrote the letter to the circuit judge, while Ethan rebuilt the fire and Caleb's men dealt with the prisoners. She wrote for a long time. Ethan watched her without watching her. The particular trick of peripheral attention he had developed over years of being around animals that didn't want to be observed. The way she held the pen. The way she stopped twice and pressed her lips together thinking, and then wrote again. The way her left wrist, the one that had been in the cuff, rested against the table edge with a careful deliberateness that told him it still hurt, and she had decided not to mention it. "You should let me look at that wrist," he said. She didn't look up from the letter. "It's fine." "It's not fine. I can see you protecting it. I'm writing." "You're writing with your right hand." She stopped, set down the pen, looked at him with an expression that was caught somewhere between irritation and something more complicated and more honest than irritation. "It's a wrist," she said. "There are larger problems." "The larger problems will still be large in 5 minutes," he said. "Let me look at it." A pause. Then she turned the wrist over on the table, an act that cost her something, though. Whether it was pride or pain, or both, he couldn't have said. He brought the tin of salve from the shelf and sat down across from her and examined the wound in the firelight. It was worse than he'd thought. The skin beneath the cuff had been abraded raw in places, and there was a section along the inner wrist that had the angry, tight look of something that wanted to become infected. He cleaned it carefully. He had done this for horses 1,000 times. The same light pressure, the same attention to the tender places, the same effort to accomplish what needed doing without causing more damage than he fixed. She didn't make a sound. "You're good at that," she said, finally watching him work. "Horses," he said. "Same principle." "You keep comparing me to your horses." "I compare everything I respect to my horses." She looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, the expression a person makes just before they decide whether to let something be funny. "That might be the strangest compliment I've ever received," she said. "Probably," he agreed and kept working. When he finished and wrapped the wrist with a strip of clean cloth, she didn't pull her hand back immediately. It rested there on the table between them, and he did not move his hands away immediately either. And the fire crackled, and the horses moved in the corral outside, and neither of them said anything for long enough that the silence stopped being accidental and became something they were both choosing. Then Charlotte picked up the pen and went back to the letter. Ethan stood and went to the window. The mountain was dark and quiet. The smoke from the feed shed had thinned to almost nothing. In the corral, Duke stood at the fence in the same place he always stood, patient, watchful, certain that the people he cared about were where they were supposed to be. "The letter's done," Charlotte said. He turned. She was holding it out to him, not handing it over exactly, but offering it, which was different. "Read it," she said. "Tell me if I've missed anything." He took it and read it by the firelight. It was precise and well organized, and devastatingly clear, the kind of writing that came from someone who understood that you did not move people by telling them what to feel, but by giving them facts that made them feel it on their own. "It's good," he said. "It's enough." He thought about Victor Harlan walking into that town hall with his pleasant voice and his certainty. Thought about Harlan's face in the moment before he'd turned and walked out, that fractional crack in the composure, that first recognition of something he hadn't anticipated. "It's more than enough," Ethan said. "The question is what he does between now and when that judge arrives." Charlotte folded the letter and sealed it. "How long will it take?" "Caleb rides hard. He can be in Rimrock by midday tomorrow. Judge Harding, if it's still Harding, he was the circuit man 2 years ago. He won't sit on something like this. Not with signed witness statements and a documented ledger." Ethan set the letter back on the table. 3 days, maybe 4. "A lot can happen in 3 days," she said. "Yes." She looked at the fire. Harlan won't come at us the same way twice. Tonight was about the horses getting me isolated, getting you chasing up the mountain on pure instinct. It didn't work." She paused. "He'll think about what did work and what didn't, and tomorrow he'll try something different." "I know. He'll go after the witnesses, Fielding, Ada. Yes, we need to warn them. We need to, at first light," he said. "Not before. Going into town in the dark right now is exactly what he'd expect after tonight." She nodded slowly. He could see the fatigue in her, not weakness, just the honest weight of 4 days in a mine shaft, and a night that had asked more from her than most people were asked in a year. She was running on decision-making and purpose, and that particular quality of will that some people carried like a structural feature built into the bones. "Sleep," he said. "A few hours. I'll take the first watch." She opened her mouth. "Not a request," he said quietly. "And not because you can't handle it. Because you have a wrecked wrist and 3 days of no proper sleep, and you'll be more useful tomorrow if you're not running on empty." She closed her mouth, looked at him. "You're better at this than I expected," she said. "At what?" "At not being alone." The words landed in the quiet of the cabin with a weight he hadn't expected. He turned back to the window so she wouldn't see whatever his face did in the moment after. "Don't get used to it," he said. But his voice had gone softer than he intended. Behind him, he heard her settle onto the bedroll. Heard the quiet of her breathing change as exhaustion finally pulled her under. The fire settled into itself. Outside, the mountain held its familiar dark. Ethan Walker stood at the window with his rifle and watched the tree line and thought for the first time in 3 years about what it felt like to be responsible for something other than horses. He wasn't sure when he had started feeling it. Maybe in the mine when she'd held that gun on him and he'd seen past it to the person holding it. Maybe in the town hall, watching her stand in front of 14 frightened people and tell the truth with no backup and no guarantee. Maybe just now wrapping her wrist in firelight while the horses moved outside. He didn't examine it. He was not ready to examine it. But he stood at the window and he kept watch, and the cabin stayed warm, and Charlotte Reed slept the first real sleep she'd had in 4 days, while the mountain held quiet around them all. Until just before dawn, Duke screamed again. And this time, it wasn't fury. It was warning. Ethan was at the door before Duke's second cry finished echoing off the ridge. He didn't wake Charlotte. He didn't have time. He took the rifle off the wall hook, pulled the door open 6 inches, and listened to the dark with every piece of attention he had. Duke was at the north end of the corral, not pacing planted. Facing out toward the tree line on the downhill side, the side that faced the trail from town. The other horses had moved away from him, pressed to the south fence, which told Ethan the threat was real and directional, and close enough that the whole string felt it. He counted heartbeats. 6, 7. A branch snapped. 30 yards out. Then silence, which was worse than the snap, because silence meant whoever was out there had heard themselves and stopped moving. He eased back inside. "Charlotte." He kept his voice at the level of breath. She was already awake, already sitting up. The .32 was in her hand. "North tree line," he said. "More than 2. They're trying to be quiet, which means they want to take us inside." She was on her feet, boots in hand, pulling them on while he talked. "Back window," she said. "Covered too, probably. They learned from last night." He moved to the table, took the letter to the judge, folded it into his shirt pocket. Looked at her. "There's a root cellar under the floor, trap door behind the woodpile. It runs about 20 feet north and opens under a flat rock near the old pine stump. You go first." "I'm not leaving you here. I'm not staying here. I'm going out the front the moment you're through. I need them to hear me so they don't find the door." He held her gaze. 20 feet, flat rock, wait for me. She looked at him hard. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Not hesitation, she was reading the plan, checking it for the holes. "You have 20 seconds, she said. "After that I come back." "Fair enough. Fair." She moved the woodpile with her hands while he shifted position near the front wall. The trapdoor lifted on old hinges that he'd oiled 3 months ago, No sound. She lowered herself in, dropped the door back into place. Ethan gave her 10 seconds to get clear. Then he opened the front door and walked out onto the porch, like a man something and come to investigate, which was true enough, and stood in plain sight with the rifle held low. "Whoever's out there," he said loud and even carrying enough to reach the tree line, "you've already been heard. I've got you to the north and I'm guessing 2 more at the south fence. What you don't have is the element of surprise." Silence. "Last night you sent 4 men. Tonight you sent more. That tells me something." He kept his weight, distributed his rifle hand easy. Victor Harlan is a man who changes his approach when the first one fails. That's smart. But what he hasn't figured out yet is that neither the woman nor the ledger is where you're looking. He was gambling. He knew he was gambling. But a gamble announced out loud in the dark to men who'd been sent to find a specific thing, and were now hearing that the thing wasn't findable. That bought confusion. And confusion bought seconds. A voice came from the tree line. Not shouting. Careful. "We're not here for the ledger." That was unexpected. "Then what?" Ethan said. "We're here for you." The man who stepped out of the tree line was not one of the rough-cut hired hands Harlan had been using. He was leaner, older, wearing a coat that fit too well for ranch work, and he walked into the partial moonlight with his hands visible and a badge pinned to his lapel that caught the light. Sheriff Briggs. Harlan had sent the law. Ethan held his position on the porch and did not lower the rifle. "Sheriff, Ethan Walker." Briggs stopped 10 feet out. Behind him, 2 deputies materialized from the tree line. Young men, both of them, with the uncomfortable posture of people following orders. They weren't entirely sure were legal. "There's a complaint filed against you. Assault. 2 of Mr. Harlan's ranch employees are claiming you attacked them without provocation last night on this property." "They were in my corral with a burning branch," Ethan said, "spooking my horses." "That's your version. That's what happened." Briggs tilted his head slightly, a gesture that acknowledged the argument and dismissed it in the same motion. "Regardless, you'll need to come down to town and answer to it, both of you." "She's not here," Ethan said. "Mr. Walker." "She's not here," he said again. "She left before dark. I don't know where she went." Briggs looked at the cabin, looked at Ethan. He was not a stupid man. He had the careful appraising eyes of someone who had spent a long time in a compromised position and stayed there by being smart enough to know exactly how compromised he was. "Mind if I take a look inside?" Briggs said. "I mind," Ethan said. "You got a paper for that?" A pause. Briggs didn't have a paper for that, and they both knew it. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Briggs said. "I'm making it exactly as hard as it legally is," Ethan said. "You come back with a warrant, you're welcome to look at anything you want. Right now, it's 4 in the morning, and you're standing on my land with a complaint that won't survive 10 minutes in front of any judge who isn't on Harlan's payroll." One of the young deputies shifted his weight. Briggs noticed. Ethan noticed Briggs noticing. "We'll be in town," Briggs said finally. "First light. Both of you, or this gets considerably more complicated." He turned and went back into the tree line. The deputies followed. Ethan stood on the porch and listened until the sound of horses moving away faded down the trail, and then he waited another full minute before he moved. He went to the old pine stump. Charlotte came up through the flat rock like she'd been counting every second which she had. "Briggs," she said. Not a question. She must have heard enough. "Harlan filed an assault complaint. Wants us in town at first light." Ethan helped her up onto level ground. "He's moving faster than I expected. He's not waiting for the judge." "He doesn't need to wait for the judge," she said. "He needs to discredit us before the judge gets here. If we're locked up on an assault charge when Judge Harding arrives, everything we have looks like the work of criminals trying to avoid prosecution." She was already thinking 3 moves ahead, and he could hear it in the speed of her words. "He's not stupid. He's trying to control the story." "Then we have to get to the story first," Ethan said. "Before he does." She looked at him. "Town. Now. Town. Now." They rode hard, and the mountain gave them safe passage, which Ethan took as neither luck nor providence, but simply the mountain being what it always was, indifferent to everyone's plans, available to those who knew how to move through it. He had spent 3 years learning its moods and its shortcuts, and he spent them now pushing the horses through the dark on paths that Harlan's men from the valley would not know. They came into Harlan Creek from the east as the first gray light started at the edges of the sky. The town was not yet awake, not fully, but smoke was already coming from Ada Pruitt's boarding house chimney, which meant Ada had been awake for an hour at least, which meant Ada had heard something. Charlotte knocked at the back door. Ada opened it immediately, fully dressed, holding a lamp. "I was expecting you," Ada said. "Come in." Inside at Ada's kitchen table sat John Fielding. He had not slept. It was visible in every line of him, the rumpled shirt, the coffee cup he'd been refilling, since God knew when, the particular exhaustion of someone who went to bed afraid and woke up more afraid, and gave up on the whole enterprise around midnight. "Harlan came to my store," Fielding said, "about 2 hours after the meeting. Didn't threaten me directly. He doesn't do it directly. That's never how it works. He just came in and stood there and said he hoped my fall grain orders were in good shape because there'd been some supply disruptions he'd heard about." Fielding's jaw tightened. "That's how he does it. Supply disruptions. He owns the freight contracts for half the county." "He went to see Reverend Moss too," Ada said. "Moss sent word through his deacon an hour ago. Harlan told the Reverend that the parsonage roof repair, the one the church council voted to fund in spring, was dependent on timber from Harlan's mill. He's pulling every string he has." "He's trying to unravel it," Charlotte said. "Before it unravels him." "Is it working?" Ethan said. Fielding and Ada looked at each other. "Not with me," Fielding said. "It cost him to say it. The cost was visible. But I can't speak for the others." "How many signed witness statements last night?" Charlotte asked. 4, Ada said. "Myself, John Reverend Moss, and Patricia Hale, whose husband lost the South Fork parcel in '86. "Where are those statements?" "With the ledger," Ada said. "Under Reverend Moss's altar." Charlotte was already moving. "We need to get to the church." The church was unlocked, as it always was, because Reverend Moss believed that a locked church was a contradiction in terms, and had never been persuaded otherwise. Charlotte pushed the door open and they went in and found Reverend Moss in the third pew. He was sitting with his hands folded and his head bowed, and he looked at first like a man in prayer. He was not in prayer. He looked up when they came in, and his face had the gray, hollowed look of someone who has been sitting with a hard choice long enough that the sitting has worn him through. "He came to see you," Charlotte said. "Last night," Moss said. "Yes." He looked at his hands. "He sat in my study, and he was very civil about it. He talked about the church, about the congregation, about how difficult it would be if certain donations were to, as he put it, find other purposes." He paused. "He talked about my predecessor, who had to leave this town in 1879 because the congregation couldn't be sustained. He was very thorough." The church was very quiet. "Where's the ledger, Reverend?" Ethan said. Moss looked at him. "It's where I put it." "Is it still there?" Charlotte asked, and the question was gentle but direct, and it carried inside it the thing nobody wanted to say out loud. Moss stood up. He walked to the front of the church to the altar, and Charlotte and Ethan followed. He lifted the floor panel, reached in, brought out the oilcloth bundle ledger inside 4 folded witness statements tucked into the front cover. He held it out to Charlotte. "I didn't give it to him," Moss said. His voice was quiet and had something in it that was harder than she'd expected. "I thought about it. I sat here from midnight until now, and I thought about it very seriously." He met her eyes. "But Thomas Murphy's boy used to sit in the 5th pew on the left side, every Sunday. He was 12 years old and he sat up straight the whole service, and when I said things that meant something to him, he nodded, just a little." Moss's jaw tightened. "I keep seeing that." Charlotte took the ledger and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that was adequate to what he had just told her. Ethan put his hand briefly on the Reverend's shoulder. That was all. It was enough. The sun was fully up when Sheriff Briggs walked into the church. He had 3 deputies with him this time. He stood in the doorway of the church with the warrant in his hand and looked at Ethan Walker with the expression of a man who has very little good feeling about what he's been asked to do. "I have a warrant," Briggs said. "Assault charges against Ethan Walker and Charlotte Reed. You'll both need to come with me." The church was not empty. That was the thing Briggs had not anticipated. Sometime in the 20 minutes since Ethan and Charlotte had arrived, Ada Pruitt had sent her deacon through 6 back doors, and those 6 back doors had opened to 12 people who had gotten dressed and come to the church without being entirely sure why, except that Ada had asked, and Ada Pruitt did not ask things without reason. They were sitting in the pews now, fielding in the front left. Patricia Hale with her husband, the livery boy who had warned them the night before. 2 farmers from the north end of the valley, whose names Ethan didn't know, but whose presence said everything that needed saying. Briggs looked at the pews, looked at Ethan. "You want to arrest us," Ethan said. "You do it in front of these people, and every one of these people is going to watch you put handcuffs on a schoolteacher who was chained in a mine for 4 days, and they are going to remember exactly what that looked like when a federal judge arrives." The word federal sat in the church air like a stone dropped in still water. One of the young deputies, the same one who had shifted his weight the night before, looked at Briggs, not with defiance, with a question. The question was, "Are we sure about this?" Briggs held the warrant and did not move. Charlotte stepped forward. "Sheriff," she said, "I know you're not a free man. I know Victor Harlan has been the reason you keep your job and the reason you keep your family's house. And I'm not standing here pretending otherwise." She held the ledger out not to him, but beside her so everyone in the pews could see it. "But in 3 days, a federal judge is going to sit in this town and read every word in this ledger and hear from every person in these pews, and the question that judge is going to ask is not what Victor Harlan did. That's already documented." She paused. "The question is going to be who helped him do it and who helped stop it. Those are the only 2 positions available, and the time for choosing between them is right now." Briggs did not move for a long moment. The church held its breath. Then slowly he folded the warrant and put it in his inside coat pocket. "This isn't finished," he said, but his voice had changed. Something in it had gone out. "No," Charlotte said. "It isn't, but it will be." Briggs turned and walked out of the church. His 3 deputies followed the young one last, and at the door he paused without turning around as if he wanted to say something, and then thought better of it, and went. The church exhaled. Then the front door blew open, and Caleb Pruitt came in at a run. He was out of breath, trail-dusted, with the look of a man who had been riding since before dawn and had not stopped for anything. "I didn't make Rimrock," Caleb said. The room went very still. "I ran into Judge Harding's party on the Rimrock Road," Caleb said. 8 miles east. He's already on his way. Somebody sent him word 2 days ago before any of this started. He'll be in Harlan Creek by midday." Charlotte turned to Ethan. "2 days ago," she said slowly. "Before I was even out of the mine." "Someone else knew," Ethan said. "Someone else sent for him." She looked at the room at Fielding, at Ada, at Reverend Moss. "Which one of you?" "Not me," said Ada Pruitt. She said it simply without drama. "But I know who did." Every head turned. Ada folded her hands in her lap with the composure of a woman who has been carrying a secret at the correct temperature for exactly the right amount of time. "Margaret Hale, Patricia's mother-in-law. She's 73 years old, and she's been writing letters to the federal circuit for 2 years, ever since her son's land was taken. Nobody paid attention to an old woman's letters." Ada allowed herself the smallest, most satisfied expression Ethan had ever seen, until one of them landed on the right desk. The room sat with that for a moment. Then Patricia Hale from the 3rd pew put her hand over her mouth exactly the way she had done the night before in the town hall. But this time what came out from behind her hand was not held-back grief. It was a laugh, a real one. Short and startled and completely genuine, the laugh of someone who has just discovered that the help they needed had already been on its way. "Tim," Victor Harlan heard about the judge's approach at 11 in the morning. Ethan wasn't there when he heard it, but he knew the shape of how it went by the shape of what came after. Within an hour, 3 of Harlan's men were seen leaving town on the northern road with packed saddlebags, which was not the behavior of men who expected their employer to prevail. Within 90 minutes, Sheriff Briggs walked into the church where Charlotte and Ethan and the witnesses had stayed, because the church was public ground, and there were enough people in it to make anything overt politically catastrophic, and asked to speak with Charlotte Reed. Ethan positioned himself where he could see both of them. "He wants to make a deal," Briggs said. He said it without looking at Charlotte directly, which told Ethan that Briggs was not here as Harlan's man. He was here as someone trying to preserve whatever was left of his own position. He'll return the land claims, the Murphy parcel, the Fielding brothers parcel, all of them. He'll pay restitution. He wants the ledger and the witness statements destroyed and a guarantee of no criminal prosecution. Charlotte looked at Briggs for a moment. "The Murphys are dead," she said. Briggs said nothing. "Thomas Murphy is dead. His wife is dead. Their 12-year-old son is dead. No land return changes that." She held the ledger against her chest. "I'm not the one who decides what happens to Victor Harlan. That's what judges are for. What I can tell you is that this ledger and every statement in it will be in Judge Harding's hands the moment he rides into this town." Briggs nodded, just once, as if he'd expected this answer, and had come partly to hear it confirmed, and partly maybe because delivering it gave him a reason to walk away from Harlan's offer himself. He left without another word. Ethan crossed the room to Charlotte. "You all right?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "I will be." "That's not what I asked." A pause, the smallest pause. "No," she said. "Not yet, but I will be." He nodded, stood beside her close enough to be felt, but not close enough to be presumptuous about it, which was a distance he was becoming aware of in a way that was entirely new and not entirely comfortable. "Ethan," she said. When this is over." She stopped, started again. "You said last night before everything happened, you said don't get used to it. Being not alone." He didn't answer immediately. "I remember," he said. "Did you mean it?" He looked at the light coming through the church windows. At the people in the pews who had come because Ada had asked them, and because Charlotte had stood in a town hall and told the truth, and because a 12-year-old boy had once nodded in a church pew on Sunday mornings and someone had remembered him. He looked at all of that, and he felt the weight of the 3 years behind him and the shape of the question in front of him. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I'm still figuring that out." She looked at him for a moment. "Fair enough," she said. And somehow in the way she said it, it wasn't a closing. It was a door left open. Judge Harding rode into Harlan Creek at 12 minutes past noon. He was a compact gray-haired man of 60 who had been riding circuit for 22 years and had the look of someone who had seen every variation of human behavior and had stopped being surprised by any of it, but had not crucially stopped caring. He rode in with 2 federal marshals at his flanks and a manner that was brisk and deliberate and entirely indifferent to local power arrangements. Charlotte met him at the edge of town. She handed him the ledger, the 4 witness statements, and a written summary she had spent the last 2 hours composing in the margin space of Ada's household ledger. He took all of it without comment, read the summary on horseback, looked up at her. "You're the school teacher," he said. "Yes, sir." "You were held in Black Hollow Mine. 4 days." He looked at the ledger, then at the town, then back at her with the particular attention of a man who has learned to look for the thing people aren't saying. "Where's Harlan?" he said. "He was at his ranch house an hour ago," Charlotte said. "I don't know if he's still there." Harding looked at his marshals. "Let's find out." Victor Harlan was still at his ranch house. That surprised people. It surprised Ethan most of all because Harlan had enough money to run and enough connections to run far, and the fact that he hadn't was either arrogance or something else, some calculation that the Ethan couldn't fully read. He understood it 2 hours later when Judge Harding came out of the ranch house and told the small crowd that had gathered in the yard that Victor Harlan had surrendered voluntarily and would be transported to the federal court in Helena for trial. Harlan came out behind the judge with his hands bound in front of him and his suit still immaculate, and his face composed with the absolute rigid control of a man who has decided that what is next he will not be seen to break. He looked at Charlotte as he passed. She met his eyes and did not look away. He looked at the last second at Ethan, and in that look there was no anger, no threat, no residual menace. There was something that Ethan, if he'd had to name it, would have called recognition. The acknowledgement of a man who had built his world on the certainty that people would not stand up meeting the fact that he had been wrong. Then the marshals put him in a wagon, and that was that. Fielding let out a breath beside Ethan that sounded like it had been held for 2 years. Patricia Hale gripped her husband's arm. Ada Pruitt stood very straight, with her hands clasped and her eyes bright, and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Reverend Moss stood at the edge of the group and looked at the wagon as it rolled away. "Thomas Murphy's boy," he said quietly to no one in particular. "I hope he can hear this wherever he is." Nobody answered him. But Ethan thought that in this case the silence was the right response, deep enough to hold it wide enough to mean it. He turned to find Charlotte standing a few feet away, watching the wagon go with the ledger, finally at last, no longer in her hands. She had given it to Judge Harding. She was standing there without it for the first time in days, and the absence of it seemed to have changed her posture slightly, not weaker, just different. Like a person who had been carrying something heavy for so long that setting it down changed their relationship with gravity. "It's done," Ethan said. "The trial isn't done," she said. "No, but the part that needed you is done." She looked at him. She was tired, genuinely deeply tired in a way that no amount of will was going to outrun for much longer. And underneath the tired something that he had not seen in her face before, a kind of raw, unguarded openness, the expression of someone whose defenses have been standing at full strength for 4 days straight and have just finally been given permission to stand down. "My schoolroom is still locked," she said, and the absolute mundaneness of it after everything, after mines and gunfire and courts and Harlan's flat. Cold eyes cracked something loose in Ethan's chest that he was not prepared for. He reached into his coat pocket and produced the bolt cutters he'd been carrying since the night before, without consciously deciding to bring them. Charlotte looked at the bolt cutters, looked at him. Something moved across her face that was exhausted and relieved, and almost exactly like the thing he'd been not examining since the night he'd watched her hold a gun steady in a mine with no more light than a candle stub. "You carried those all day," she said. "Seemed like they might be useful," he said. She laughed. Not the polite, controlled kind, the real kind. The kind that came from somewhere deep and surprised, and had nothing to do with wanting to seem a certain way. It lasted only a few seconds, but it filled the space between them like the first honest thing either of them had let themselves feel in longer than this particular crisis. Ethan Walker, for the second time in 4 days, did not know what to do with what was happening in his chest. He started walking toward the schoolroom. After a moment, Charlotte fell in beside him. And the afternoon light of a Montana summer came down on the main street of Harlan Creek, and neither of them said anything else, because sometimes the silence between two people stops being empty and starts being the most honest conversation they've had. The schoolroom lock came off in one clean cut. Charlotte pushed the door open and stood in the doorway for a moment without going in. Ethan stayed a step behind her, giving her the space to do this at her own pace, the way he gave horses space at a gate they'd been kept from. He had learned that you did not rush the moment when something that had been closed finally opened. She went in. The room was exactly as it had been. Chalk dust on the board. Small desks in their rows. The battered globe on the corner shelf. The map of the United States with its hand-colored territories that she had drawn herself because the school board hadn't budgeted for a proper one. 4 days she'd been gone from this room. It looked like 4 years hadn't touched it. She put her hand on the nearest desk, just rested it there. "I have 14 students," she said. "Youngest is 6, oldest is 15, and will age out next spring." She wasn't talking to Ethan exactly. She was talking to the room, reorienting herself inside it. I've been teaching here for 3 years. Same amount of time you've been on the mountain. Seems like a long time to both of us, Ethan said. She turned around and looked at him standing in the doorway. The afternoon light was behind him. She looked at this man who had come into a mine shaft for a stranger because his horse told him to, who had stood at a back wall in a town hall and said 4 words that changed the direction of an entire room, who had wrapped her wrist by firelight with the same hands he used to gentle, frightened horses, and who was now standing in the door of her schoolroom with bolt cutters in his hand. Like that was the most natural thing in the world. What happens now? She said. For you, I mean. Go back up the mountain, he said. String needs proper pasture. Shed needs rebuilding. I've got 2 months of work backed up. And after that? He looked at the globe on the shelf. More of the same, probably. Probably, she said. The word landed with a particular weight. Not an accusation, just an observation from someone who had learned in 4 days to pay attention to the difference between what Ethan Walker said and what he meant. He didn't answer that. He set the bolt cutters against the wall outside and came in properly, looking around the room the way he looked at any new space. Reading it, understanding what it said about the person who inhabited it. The books organized by reading level. The drawings pinned to the wall, some of them years old, judging by the curl of the paper. A list of arithmetic rules written in a careful hand above the blackboard. Check your work. A wrong answer found is better than a wrong answer kept. You wrote that, he said, nodding at the sign. First week I was here, she said. Half my students had been told they were too dumb to learn. I wanted them to understand that mistakes were part of the process, not the end of it. She paused. It's the same thing I tell myself. He looked at her. She met his eyes and did not look away, and the thing between them that had been building since a mine shaft and a candle stub, and a woman pointing a gun at a stranger, was right there in the room with them fully present, no longer something that either of them could reasonably pretend wasn't happening. Ethan, she said. I know, he said. I'm not asking you for anything. I know that too, but I want to say it anyway. She straightened slightly the way she always did when she was about to say something that cost her. You didn't have to come in after me. You didn't have to bring me to your cabin. You didn't have to stand in a town hall or ride down a mountain in the dark or spend 2 nights not sleeping so you could watch a tree line. She held his gaze. You did all of that when you had every reason not to. I want you to know that I see it, that it matters. Ethan Walker had received very few direct expressions of gratitude in his life, and the ones he had received he had deflected with the ease of long practice. He opened his mouth to deflect this one. He closed it again. Because she wasn't thanking him exactly. She was seeing him, and those were different things, and his usual armor didn't fit right against the second one. You're the one who stood up in that hall, he said finally. I just stood nearby. You stood first, she said. That's the whole thing. That's what matters. The room was very quiet. Outside, the town was going about its afternoon rebuilding its sense of normalcy with the determined efficiency of people who have been through something and have decided to come out the other side. Voices, footsteps, a wagon rolling down the main street. The sounds of ordinary life resuming. I should get back up the mountain, Ethan said. Check on the horses. Make sure Caleb's men are... Tomorrow, Charlotte said. He looked at her. Stay tonight, she said. Ada will have dinner. There'll be people. It won't be... She searched for the word required. Any of it. But stay. He thought about the mountain, about the cabin and the corral, and the particular quality of silence that he had built his life around. He thought about Duke, who was in Caleb's care and was fine, and who would still be fine tomorrow morning. All right, he said. Tonight. Ada Pruitt's dining room held 14 people for supper, which was 11 more than it usually held on a Tuesday, and 6 more chairs than Ada actually owned, a problem she solved with the kitchen stools and an upturned crate, and the absolute refusal to acknowledge that any of this was unusual. The food was extraordinary. Ethan didn't know how Ada had produced it on the time scale available: roasted chicken and cornbread and green beans with side pork and 2 kinds of pie. And he suspected that several of the women at the table had contributed without being asked. Which was the particular genius of a community that had just rediscovered itself and wanted to express it through something tangible. He sat at the far end of the table and let the conversation around him, which was his natural position in a room full of people and which tonight felt different from how it usually felt. Usually, it felt like correct distance. Tonight, it felt occasionally like something he was choosing to maintain when he might not need to. Fielding talked. He was a different man across a dinner table than he'd been in his grain store at 2 in the morning, looser, relieved, with a dry humor that had been buried under 2 years of fear and came out now in small, careful doses, like a man relearning a skill he thought he'd lost. He told a story about his brother Daniel, something funny that had happened on the disputed land before Harlan took it, and the laughter that came from the table was the particular kind that happens when people are laughing at something that was also terrible. And the laughter is how they carry both things at once. Reverend Moss ate quietly and spoke little, and listened to everything. And Ethan, who had been watching people for 3 years from a distance, and had gotten very good at reading what they weren't saying, could see the man actively reconstructing something inside himself. Reassembling a self-image that fit better than the one he'd been wearing. Charlotte sat across the table from Ethan 3 seats down, and talked to Patricia Hale about the school. About Margaret Hale, Patricia's mother-in-law, who had been writing letters to federal judges for 2 years without telling anyone because she hadn't wanted to raise hopes that might not be fulfilled. About the kind of stubborn, quiet courage that doesn't look like courage because it doesn't announce itself and doesn't expect recognition. "She sounds like someone I'd like to meet," Ethan said. Charlotte looked at him across the table. It was the first thing he'd said in an hour, and it had come out before he fully decided to say it. And everyone within earshot registered it, because they registered the fact that Ethan Walker, the Mountain Cowboy, who had sat at the end of their table for an hour, absorbing everything, like a man who had forgotten what rooms full of people felt like, had just expressed a desire to meet someone, which implied being around, which implied return. Charlotte held his gaze for just a moment. "She comes to the school sometimes," she said, "to read to the younger children. She'll be here Thursday." Said Ethan. Said Ada Pruitt, who missed absolutely nothing and refilled his coffee without being asked. He left before dawn. Not because he was running. He had made that distinction clearly to himself the night before, lying on the cot that Ada had put in the small room off the kitchen. There was a difference between leaving because you needed to and leaving because you were afraid of what staying meant. He was leaving because the horses needed him and the mountain was his, and those were real reasons, not invented ones. He saddled up in the quiet of the livery alone, except for the stable boy who had warned them 2 nights ago and who was asleep in the hayloft and who Ethan decided not to wake. He took a piece of paper from his shirt pocket, the back of one of the unused pages from Charlotte's household ledger, which Ada had given him last night without explanation, and which he understood was not accidental, and wrote something on it. 4 lines. He read them back to himself, once decided they were honest, if not eloquent, and left the paper folded on Ada's kitchen table on his way out. The ride up the mountain in the early dark was familiar, and right in the way that home is always right when you've been away from it. Duke knew the trail without being guided, and Ethan let the horse lead, sitting loose in the saddle, feeling the altitude come back to him in the cool of the air, and the particular smell of pine and granite that meant this specific place in the world. Caleb was awake at the cabin, as he'd said he would be tending the fire, with the easy competence of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors. The horses were calm. The feed shed was structurally intact, despite the burn, and the corral fence that Harlan's men had pulled boards from had been patched with timber from Caleb's own saddlebag lashing. "How is she?" Caleb said without preamble. "She'll be all right," Ethan said. Caleb looked at him. "And you?" Ethan unsaddled Duke and hung the saddle on the fence rail. "Working on it," he said. Caleb nodded in the manner of a man who understood that this was the most complete answer available and was satisfied with it. He finished his coffee, thanked Ethan for the horse's care during the chaos, which was decent of him and unnecessary, and typically Pruitt, and rode back down the mountain as the sun came up. Ethan stood in the corral with Duke for a while. He did what he'd always done when he needed to think clearly. He worked. He moved through the morning tasks with his hands, and let the repetition do what repetition always did, which was to quiet the part of his brain that wanted to perform an emotion, and let the actual emotion come through clean. What came through was this: he had been alone for 3 years, and had told himself it was wisdom, and it wasn't. It was grief wearing the costume of preference. His fiancée had died, and he had taken the deepest pain of his life and converted it into a philosophy of solitude, and for 3 years the philosophy had held because nothing had been strong enough to challenge it. And then a horse had stopped walking, and a woman had held a gun on him in the dark, and the philosophy had piece by piece in the space of 4 days come entirely apart. He sat with that. He did not try to make it smaller or larger than it was. He just sat with it the way you sit with any true thing, not comfortable, not uncomfortable, just honest. 3 weeks passed. He rebuilt the feed shed. He ran the horses through their summer pasture rotation. He fixed the section of corral fence that had been damaged and added 2 new rails to a section that had been weak since spring. He did the work of the mountain, which was the same work it had always been, in the same quiet, in the same altitude. But the quiet was different now. He knew that. He could not unknow it. On the 18th day, a rider came up the mountain. Not Charlotte, a boy of about 10, one of her students by the look of him, town clothes a horse too big for him that he handled with the determined dignity of someone who'd been given an important errand and intended to discharge it properly. He found Ethan at the water trough and held out a folded note. "Miss Reed asked me to bring this," the boy said. "She said no need for an answer unless you have one." Ethan unfolded the note. 4 lines, same length as what he'd left on Ada's table. "The trial date has been set. Helena, 4 weeks from Monday. Judge Harding wants me to testify in person. I'm going. I thought you should know. C.R." And then below that, in slightly different ink, as if added after Margaret Hale says she'd still like to meet the man who went into the mine. "I told her I wasn't sure you came down the mountain for anything less than an emergency. She said that was probably not entirely true anymore. I think she might be right." Ethan folded the note. He looked at the boy, who was waiting with the patience of a child who has been told to wait. "Tell Miss Reed I said thank you for letting me know," Ethan said. "And tell her," he stopped, "tell her I reckon Margaret Hale is a smart woman." The boy repeated this to himself twice to make sure he had it, then turned his horse and went back down the mountain with the focused confidence of his mission successfully completed. Ethan watched him go. Duke came up beside him and put his nose against Ethan's shoulder with the gentle insistence he used when he had an opinion. "I know," Ethan said. "I know." He rode down to Harlan Creek on a Thursday. He hadn't planned it that way consciously, but he had known when he was saddling Duke in the early morning that Thursday was the day Margaret Hale came to the school to read to the younger children, and that was not a coincidence. He was willing to pretend wasn't a decision. The town looked different in the weeks since the arrest. Not transformed towns didn't transform. They adjusted, recalibrated, settled into new arrangements of themselves, but different in the particular way of a place that has stopped holding its breath. Fielding's grain store had a new sign above the door. The hotel where Harlan's men had been stationed had fresh window boxes. Small things. The kind of small things that accumulate into the feeling that something has shifted at the foundation. He left Duke at the livery. The stable boy recognized the horse before he recognized Ethan, which seemed correct, and walked to the schoolroom. He could hear it from the yard. A woman's voice, old and certain and warm, reading aloud. And underneath it, the particular silence of children who are actually listening, which is a different quality of silence from all other kinds. He stood in the yard, under the oak tree, and listened to the end of whatever the story was. And when the old woman's voice finished, and the children's voices rose, in the way children's voices do. At the end of a story, he went to the door and knocked. Charlotte opened it. She looked at him for a moment without saying anything. She was wearing her school dress, the gray one or one very like it, with her hair pinned back and the chalk dust on her hands that told him she'd been working before the reading started. The bruise on her jaw was gone. Her wrist, visible below the cuff, had healed to a thin pink line. "You came on a Thursday," she said. "I did," he said. "That was deliberate." "Yes." She held the door open wider and he came in. The children looked at him with the frank, uncomplicated curiosity of people not yet old enough to pretend not to notice things. There were 14 of them. He counted automatically. The youngest in the front row was a small girl with her hair in 2 braids who looked at him with very large, very serious eyes, and then went back to her slate with the air of someone who had assessed the situation and found it not immediately relevant. In the chair at the front of the room, Margaret Hale was exactly what the letters she'd been writing for 2 years had implied she would be: a small woman of 73, with white hair and bright eyes, and the settled, unperformative dignity of someone who has been right about something for a long time and has finally been told so. She looked at Ethan. "So you're the one who went into the mine," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Because your horse stopped walking." "That's right." She considered this with complete seriousness. "Good horse," she said. "The best I've ever known," Ethan said. Margaret Hale smiled at him. It was the smile of someone who has spent a lifetime reading people at a glance and has just confirmed a preliminary judgment. "Sit down," she said. "I'll read another chapter if the children want one." The children very clearly wanted one. Ethan sat in the back of the room on a chair that was slightly too small for him and listened to an old woman read to 14 children in a Montana schoolroom in the summer of 1887, and something in his chest, which had been carefully maintaining its defenses for 3 years and 4 days, set down its weapons and sat. Afterward, when the children had gone, and Margaret Hale had been walked to her wagon by 2 of the older students who competed for the honor of carrying her books, Charlotte sat at her desk and Ethan sat in the chair he'd occupied in the back of the room, and neither of them hurried toward the conversation. "She likes you," Charlotte said. "She was testing me," Ethan said. "She was very good at it. She's been testing people for 70 years. She says you can learn everything you need to know about a person by how they listen." "How'd I do?" "You listened to the whole chapter," Charlotte said. "You didn't pretend to for the first few minutes and then let your mind go somewhere else. You actually listened." "It was a good story," he said. "It was a good story," she agreed. A pause. Outside, the town was going through its afternoon. "The trial," Ethan said. "Helena, 4 weeks from Monday." "Yes." "You'll need to get there and back. It's a hard ride to make alone." She looked at him, very directly. "Are you offering—" "I'm noting a logistical fact," he said. "Ethan." "Charlotte." She put down the pen she'd been holding. "If you're going to say something, say it. I've been a school teacher for 3 years. I have very little patience for people talking around the thing they mean." He looked at his hands, at the room, at the globe on the shelf and the arithmetic sign above the board, and the small desk in the front row where the serious girl with 2 braids had assessed him and returned to her slate. "When my fiancé died," he said, "I decided the safest thing was to need nobody. I got pretty good at it. Good enough that I started thinking it was wisdom instead of what it actually was." He looked up at her. "It took a horse and a mine shaft and a woman who pointed a gun at me to figure that out. I'm a slow learner." Charlotte was very still. "I'm not asking for anything that's not freely given," he said. "And I'm not made for town life, Charlotte. I need to be honest about that. I'm made for the mountain and the horses and the kind of quiet that most people don't want." "I know that," she said. "But I could come down more often," he said. "On Thursdays maybe, and other days. And you could—" He stopped, started again. "The mountain's quiet, but it's not bad, in the summer especially, if you ever wanted to see it properly, not running from something." Charlotte Reed, who had held herself together through 4 days in a mine and a town hall confrontation, and a night of gunfire, and a federal arrest, and 3 weeks of rebuilding a normal life from the pieces of a very abnormal week, looked at Ethan Walker, and felt something let go inside her that she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Yes," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. "Yes, to which part?" he said. "All of it," she said. "Yes, to all of it." He looked at her for a long moment. And then Ethan Walker, who had not allowed himself to want anything beyond horses and altitude and the particular mercy of an uncomplicated life, let himself want this, simply, without armor, without the philosophy of distance that had served him for 3 years and had never once, not for a single morning, made him feel less alone. "All right," he said. "Then all right." They rode up to the mountain together that afternoon before the light went. Charlotte on Duke Ethan leading the way, the trail familiar under both their feet now in a way it hadn't been 3 weeks ago when she'd been clinging to a horse in the dark, running from something. Now there was nothing to run from, and nowhere to be except here. And the difference between those two kinds of riding was the difference between surviving and living. Duke moved beneath her with that slow, deliberate gait that she had come to understand was not age or limitation, but character. The walk of a horse that had decided 17 years ago that steady and certain was worth more than fast and careless. She understood that now in a way she hadn't when she'd first ridden him out of a mine. At the top of the last switchback where the trail crested and the mountain opened out into the high meadow, Ethan stopped. Charlotte brought Duke up beside him, and they sat for a moment looking at what the mountain looked like in the late afternoon summer light. The long grass moving the peaks beyond it. The sky that high altitude gave you wider and more serious than valley sky. "It's beautiful," she said. "I know," he said. And the way he said it told her he wasn't only talking about the mountain. Duke dropped his head and cropped a mouthful of grass. Entirely unbothered. Entirely certain that this was where things were supposed to be. He had known 3 weeks ago standing at a corral fence in the dark, listening for trouble. He had known 17 years of knowing the truth that the best thing a person could do was stop when something mattered and refuse to walk past it. Ethan Walker had finally learned to listen. Not to the silence he'd been curating on the mountain, careful and deliberate, and ultimately lonely. Not to the voice that told him needing nobody was the same thing as being strong. But to the older, quieter voice underneath all of that, the one that sounded, if he was honest, a lot like an old gray horse who had seen enough of the world to know what was worth stopping for. He looked at Charlotte Reed riding his best horse in the late summer light of the Montana high country, 3 weeks after a mine shaft and a gun and a truth that changed a town. And he understood that the life he was going to build from here would require him to be braver than anything Harlan had asked of him. Braver than riding into a dark corral or standing in a church with a warrant pointed at him or any of the physical things that had happened in those 4 days. Because those things were just danger. And danger he knew. This was something else. This was the courage of a man who has been broken and rebuilt himself in the wrong shape, finally willing to take the whole structure apart and try again. Not because someone forced him. Not because the alternative was worse. But because a September morning on a high mountain trail with a woman beside him who had seen exactly who he was and said yes to all of it, the wrong shape finally felt like what it was. And that was the day Ethan Walker stopped being a man who lived alone on a mountain. Not because the mountain changed, not because he changed his address or his habits or the particular way he moved through a world that had never made it particularly easy to stay in it. But because the walls he had built, careful high maintained over 3 years, with the same diligence he gave his horses and his fences, had come down in 4 days piece by piece, one honest thing at a time, and he was not going to rebuild them. Some walls, once they're down, you leave down. You take the timber and you build something else instead. Something with a door in it. Something with room for 2. Courage doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always ride in fast and loud and armed for a fight. Sometimes it stands at the top of a mountain trail in the summer light. And it looks like a man who has finally stopped running from the best thing that's ever stopped him. Cold. And sometimes it looks like a woman who pointed a gun at that man in the dark and chose when the light came to put it down.